Good morning, everybody. How are you all? Too many pirates and princesses parties, too many pub crawls, too many boot camps. I'm very glad to see you all here. I'm honored and thrilled to speak to this august community assembled here again, in person, in this room. I know it's early. Thank you for being here. 9 years ago, I spoke on this exact same topic, it turns out. I had no recollection until 2 days ago. And the fact is that in 9 years, a lot has changed, so I think it's worth taking a look again. So first, let myself introduce myself. I am an identity protocol wonk. I'm a former analyst, and I head up ForgeRock's innovation labs. ForgeRock exists to help people safely and simply access the connected world. So I thought that I would try and make sure that everybody's staying awake today by playing a game together. Are you up for that? Okay. Are you up for that? All right. So trendiness made me think of Justin Richards' card game, Cards Against Identity, for horrible identity professionals. You can find him to get your copy. The cards are just for illustration today. You don't have to know how CAI works or how Cards Against Humanity works. So here is what this game is about. It's a little bit different. It's called Trends and Transients and Tropes and Transparents. It's about what's hot, what's not, what's complicated, and what ought to change in the future. We're going to be reviewing some key concepts that are floating around this week. There's quite a lot of them. And it's all to help us figure out how to tell if we're actually achieving the aims we've said we have. So at the end, I'll propose some new success criteria in the hope that they're meaningful and useful to you. Oh, and by the way, I will be declaring something dead today. So here's how it works. We're going to consider a number of topics. I want you to shout out what category you think each one is. So let's test it out on a concept that's kind of adjacent to identity. Post-quantum blockchain. There's a book that talks about it. So what are the definitions of these categories? A trend is a topic that deserves to be hot and is hot. Hot for a good reason. A transient is when something may not be long for this world, at least in its current form. A trope is when you're kind of tempted to make air quotes when you say it. Like, I don't know, for years, digital transformation. I mean, it's a real thing, but it tends to be misapplied, misunderstood. And a transparent, this is the tricky one I've discovered, it basically means you're looking right through it and you really ought not to. So don't confuse this with somebody being open and transparent with someone. So what do you think post-quantum blockchain is? Trope. Interesting. Well, here's some evidence to consider. Nobody's even searching on it. You guys are special. So I'm going to say it's a transparent. Okay, I want to get started, but first, taking a cue from Ian the other day, I need to make a public service announcement. I mean, if he can share a photo of his pup, I get to do the same. That's Sabrina. What does it really mean for people to safely and simply access the connected world? I put it to you that pushing digital identity, there are those quotes, into people's consciousness has not been all that successful. We use language here like, you can control your own identity. And yet, nobody wakes up and says, I think I'll do that today because it's so much fun. So to see why that is, I wanted to take a look at what businesses and people really want out of identity. And I'm using a jobs to be done framework. Who here is familiar with jobs to be done? Product managers in the crowd. It is, okay, ooh, all right, I'll tell you what it is. It is a prioritization framework for figuring out the higher purpose for what a customer would buy in a product or in a solution. So it's really thinking higher level. By the way, I'm contractually obligated to do this in Venn diagram form. You guys, some of you know me, so be prepared. Here's the start of it. Security and experience are twin foundations, right, of what we do. They're represented here with protection and personalization, so I can remember them. And the thing is, the design of everyday identity is a no-compromise deal. I think we know that now after working on it for like 10 plus years. Protection and personalization actually share a lot of drivers. And in fact, poor experience impacts security and trust and things like that. So what I'm reflecting here is both must-haves for compliance, say, and also the wanna-haves for digital transformation on the part of both of those constituencies. But the identity drivers are actually growing, so let's look at two more sets of them. Here's one, payment. Payment and identity are very different from each other, but they have long-formed foundations for each other. Think about why we call it an account in identity. Payment includes banking, retail, e-commerce, loyalty cards, loyalty systems, and now cryptocurrency. Really anything that represents a flow of transaction value. Crypto, of course, puts payments kind of into the network. It's more peer-to-peer than those other methods, but identity is important, actually, to them all. The final set here is people. And I'm sure some of you are saying, haven't people been part of this equation all along? We've certainly worked very hard to try and make it so. There may be some people here from the original user-centric identity wars. I mean, we've been working on it really hard. But one way to see this is that individuals have unique, apart from business, drivers to seek out digital transformation. And many of those drivers are basically multi-identity, right? If you think about it, they're like sharing information selectively and connecting with each other. I mean, this use case has been in front of us all the time if you've been on social media, but these are positive and proactive reasons to infuse identity into connected services. So this is how I see identity jobs to be done. The I word is barely in there. All right, time to play the game. Category 1 is decentralization and/or wallets. So the theme here might be, let's make it so we can't be evil. I want to lay out the table here with this whole landscape. This Venn diagram I did not do. It's actually by my colleague, David Luna. I found it very helpful. You know, at ForgeRock, we invite people to imagine what it means never to log in again. And we actually believe that wallets may be the last thing you ever log into. But they are a many splendored thing, and we actually don't know in the future how many we're going to have. So if wallets are physical wallet analogs, if Web3 is about the next-gen back-end technology, and if decentralized identity is about making identity peer-to-peer the way we've seen other things go peer-to-peer, let's try and understand their commonalities. One of the things that we've learned over the last few years, remember when decentralized identity started life as blockchain identity? Oh, I said it. Anybody remember the drinking game? Is it 8:30? Too early to start drinking? It turns out doesn't have to be involved. Cheers. So there's one more thing that I wanted to add to this picture that doesn't belong in any of the bubbles. So technically, I could have made a 4-set Venn. I didn't have the heart to perpetrate 2 of those on you this morning. There's no wallet required credentials that are really pretty popular today. How many people have, gotten certified in a training course for anything at all? I tried to put it in to the intersection between DI and Web3, and it really doesn't apply. It doesn't work. So we've got an existence proof of something like that today. So how do we gain perspective on all of this? A major goal of decentralized identity is really automation and efficiency, enabling the results of identity data verification to be reused. But we've actually had that technology or something that can do that for quite a long time. Heck, SAML came out of the gate with a lot of attribute sharing stuff in it. So what's been holding us back? I want to take a really clear-eyed look at this. What are the tensions? Well, technical versus business trust is a really big one. There's a lot of deliberate throttling going on. I think we've probably all noticed it when it comes to, let's say, OAuth client IDs, which are very easy to generate at scale. And then again, we have a lot of frameworks to lock that down. Take a look at all the open banking initiatives. Oops, sorry, I didn't build it out for you. Secondly, we've got the fact that disruptive technology is disruptive. What I mean by hybrid enterprise there is, some of the folks that we work with, are representing enterprises that go back many decades. I don't know if anybody remembers in the beginning of the pandemic, there were calls for COBOL programmers. Yeah, no technology that's deployed ever really dies. So that's important to know. A third tension is the aim of outsourcing another job, like getting verified data, to would-be relying parties. Any service provider that needs high-quality data is going to lean towards collecting it on their own because of the danger of what happens if you don't do that. I always think of blood types. I actually can't remember my blood type, but maybe a lot of people know it. But if they go into an emergency room and say, I swear to you, I'm A negative, no one will believe them. And there's a lot of technology infrastructure in the world that we could connect and make it happen to source that piece of information. Relative to testing it again, right there as a first party, it tends not to win. Finally, what I like to call insidious re-centralization. Now, a number of writers have pondered this question very lately. There was Moxie's piece on Web3, pointing out the fallacy of thinking that decentralization tech necessarily means decentralization. Also, Mark Nottingham just wrote a fantastic IETF internet draft on internet centralization, pointing out in detail all of the ecosystem incentives that make operations roll towards the center. Really good piece, I recommend it. So, what can we do about this? What are our opportunities? Well, we've been very ambitious around universal ecosystems, things like COVID status, and haven't really taken off. And I think even that was too ambitious. So I think we need to try for ecosystems that are smaller in size and get all the way through to full production so that we can learn from them. Secondly, anybody familiar with the word subsidiarity? It's sort of been making the rounds lately. It's basically a kind of federation or outsourcing with a bias towards keeping everything that's important as close to you as possible. So I suggest that we start to plan for documenting how we outsource and how far away we outsource things in our systems, the same way that we document APIs. Third, okay, I think it's time to find the new killer app. We haven't found it yet. We need to find the key credential that actually helps to align ecosystems incentives, including everybody in the sort of triangle, but it's a more complicated picture there than just saying you're doing it for the holder or saying that you're doing it for a verifier when you haven't found the verifiers yet. I did want to point out that in a lot of cases, particularly, I'm going to say civil ID, cross-border ID, the way I think of them is that they're more like supply chain management for humans or provenance tracking of humans, where you have to do privacy, than like controlling your own identity. It's just a different category. It's hard to get people to really want that, right? Okay, time to assess some concepts. This is a highly idiosyncratic and probably incomplete graph of my own devise. Just want to highlight a few things, and I'll just observe, we're not seeing a lot of can't be evil outcomes yet. If that's what we really want, we need to think hard about that. So, what do you think wallets come out as? What kind of thing? One of the 4 T's. Let me have it. Trend. Okay. I agree. I think it's a legitimate trend, though its final form in people's hands is going to be something we probably don't expect. Okay, I got a pair of things here. Data verification and verifiable credentials. What do you think about them? Trend, also trend. Okay, I also agree. Notice I didn't say identity verification. I think this market could explode to arbitrary data, but we haven't unlocked that yet. Not far from it. Oh, what do you think about cryptocurrency? Transient. It's a fad. Is it? I don't know. Anyone disagree with transient? Did you know that it's reportedly used by 40 million Americans and, of course, millions upon millions of other folks in the world? I say trend. So the toys and risk stage that I think we're in with cryptocurrency is really important for real experimentation. Yeah, sometimes it hurts, but putting things into production teaches you things about unintended consequences. And boy, are we learning them, aren't we? What do you think about federation? Going back in time. Transparent. Interesting. Has it just melted into the woodwork? I actually think, trick question, I actually think it's timeless. I think it's always going to be there, and I think it's going to be implemented by folks for a really long time, and it's not going to go away in our systems. And I'm not calling it COBOL, I swear. Web3 and metaverse. Trope? Yeah. I think they're tropes. They're often used as a kind of talisman waved at people to achieve certain things, and they're often misapplied. Heck, we're already up to Web 5, aren't we? So, Web 42 can't be far behind. Oh, lest you thought I forgot about NFTs. What are they? Transparent, interesting. I think a case could be made for transparent. Here's where I went. New drinking game. When you hear NFT, you drink absinthe. Not too early. It's never too early for absinthe. All right. Wallet security. Transparent. Okay, so you are the folks who should know, and we're the folks who should do something about it, particularly the binding to a person. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. What about, I put them together, relying parties, correlation, and autonomy. Things that, I don't know, maybe you think they don't go together? What do you think a relying party is? Anybody care about autonomy? Being able to act on your own behalf without constraint? So I think they're transparent. I think they're all transparent. We're forgetting to ask what it takes to overcome data outsourcing risk and liability concerns. We're forgetting to ask what people really want. They don't just want leave me alone. They don't just want that view of things. And we're forgetting that just a very few voluntarily shared pieces of information because of mutual benefit will identify you. That is a serious transparent, I think, in our industry. Finally, what do you think about trust frameworks and decentralized identifiers? Head scratcher. Okay, I'll tell you what I think. Another trick question. I'm going to call them tentatives. I think the jury is out. Steve Wilson, in a little while here this morning, will be talking about, he's been pointing out this week, just how many trust frameworks we have. And both trust frameworks and DIDs suffer from that business trust tension. But I think that's an opportunity for innovation. Okay, that was round one. Round two, privacy and/or trust. The and/or I kind of like because it's like, well, they might reinforce each other, but they might not. The theme here is at least don't be evil. So let's take a tour of the zeitgeist here. I like to use a kind of a pyramid to describe the data privacy 2.0 world that we're in. So data protection has always been the base. Think about the Data Protection Directive. It was really about, it's not just was, still is, about not accidentally letting the data out. And it really kind of has always, that mindset has always treated data subjects as kind of passive lumps without agency. This is where privacy regulation started. However, we've been sort of building up and understanding the context in which it appears. On the left, we have some adjacent societal forces. On the right, we have some particularly relevant standards, mandates. Data transparency, little bit newer, almost invention. So here I'm using it to mean open and honest about what data you want, what you've done with the data you've got. And its adjacencies reflect, I would say, the start of the modern regulatory regime. Things like you have to be told. You have to tell people what happened to the data. The pinnacle is data control. That's where people get choice and agency. It has quite a few adjacent movements and standards that I'm sure we'll all be familiar with. And I think this is really where the energy is, moving outside of an entirely regulatory mindset. So a lot of enterprises I find in my conversations are desiring to move up the pyramid so that they can lead in all of these areas. Why? Because they want to become more trustworthy and not just in a compliance sense. So, consent has magical powers, right? Unfortunately, our current strategies are not generally producing the actual outcomes we keep saying we want. The gold standard is to collect consent. But the way that we're doing it, we're well aware, is kind of meaningless, right? I mean, this is an example from some research that I did with a colleague that referenced some other research. It's well known that this regime is not really choice, it's not really control. Worse, approval is turning into an attack surface. Rote actions lead to what I call inattention attacks. So, unfortunately, worse still, this is actually costing people money. So in short, I would say there's kind of a dark pattern at the heart of consent as practiced today, which is, I mean, maybe that's a really harsh way to put it. There's now some regulations against dark patterns, but if it's baked into your solution, what do you do? What do you do when we have more IoT data sources and more IoT devices that are generating data? Well, I want to make some suggestions about how we can fix this. First of all, I really think we have to think bigger about the world of permissions, going back to jobs to be done. People don't really distinguish between user profile management, preference setting, consent, sharing, setting up trusted devices, and all of that. So we really need to be thinking bigger. We also really ought to be thinking about collecting permissions asynchronously from when we want someone to use a service. That means their decision will be without influence, without a lot of influence. That ensures they're more meaningful. And then finally, start paying more attention to individuals' incentives to play. The future of personalized services and marketing, I believe, is to become more measurable corporate assets along these lines. So you know I care a lot about relationships and delegation. It's important to realize that permissioning is not exclusively a solo endeavor. Some of the people drivers for identity involve multiple people, multiple identities, multiple devices, multiple services, even multiple personas. This example shows circle of life requirements, if you will, for sharing access. And it comes from some work on how healthcare data records are shared. And this is young Julie Adams, who grows up and makes different choices about who needs to see what in order to have a say in her own care. And you can get the report online. Okay, so let's play the game again. Time to assess these concepts. The whole point of privacy regulations is at least don't be evil. And can we say it's not working very well? Can we say that it costs more to do consent now, even if it's the best thing on the planet? So here you see a couple things that appeared earlier. They're here for context. They relate. What do you think data privacy itself is? Come on, louder. Trend. Okay, preponderance says trend. I actually agree, and I'll tell you why. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of regulatory action going on. There's also a huge amount of privacy tech innovation going on. I've had many conversations with folks who are doing really interesting things. And so I think it's a definite trend. And consumers have more choices that they're availing themselves of because they don't suck, like Signal and DuckDuckGo. So now we have sort of an interesting mix, ad tech and technology ethics. What do you think they are? Transparent. Okay. My take is ad tech in its current form is going away, and it's because technology ethics is coming up. It's a really good thing. Thank goodness. Relationships and IoT. Trend. You guys are so with it. You're up on the top things. I think relationships are a legitimate trend. I think IoT, for many, is still a transparent. We're just not getting the scale and automation required to handle it in this context at all. We're really going to need some of the things that I was talking about. Censorship resistance. What is it? I think it's a transparent. Privacy, particularly data privacy, is really shoehorned into a simple way of thinking about personal data and what happens to it. But all of those adjacent things are adding up if you think about the consumer protection and the antitrust things that are going on. In part are about people's right of agency, right of expression, right of sharing. All the open API movements are about that as well, and I think that there's not a recognition about the many facets of privacy. The biggie, digital consent. Is it hot? Is it not? Is it complicated? What do you say? It's complicated. Here's my take on it. It's dead. It's The Walking Dead. It doesn't know it. We cannot go on the way we have. We need to start thinking outside the box. Some folks have been thinking outside the box. Regulations do not recognize that yet. And Justin, of course, was prescient in having consent in his deck. Okay, last category. Security and/or experience. The theme for this one might be, at least don't be stupid. Okay, what do I mean by macronutrient here? Authentication is supposedly something you know, something you have, something you are. We're trying to get rid of a whole category. And I will tell you, I spent many years doing low carb, convincing other people to do it, and ultimately it didn't work that well for me and it was really hard. Authentication is complex. Passwords keep winning because the trade-offs are hard. And actually 9 years ago, I showed the same diagram showing that usability pushes down security. Security pushes down usability. Deployability pushes them both down. Expediency tends to be king. In the quest to replace passwords research, passwords were far and away the winner, if you will, in looking at the 25 criteria they developed. 2 of those 25 criteria were resilient to phishing and memory-wise effortless. There are a lot of other criteria. So we're picking away at objections in all 3 areas, but static shared secrets are really buried underneath a lot of what we're doing. So what are our opportunities around not just reducing risk, but increasing delight? Be deliberate about addressing all of these criteria. We've got some enumerated, maybe they're not right in the modern era, let's redo them, and then we can weight them per scenario. Be flexible to all kinds of evolving methods, technologies, business needs, vulnerabilities. You don't want to get sucked into a security monoculture. And you need to give people choice about things that are equally strong. And lastly, you really need to design journeys that adapt to runtime context, because collecting the wrong signals or too coarse-grained signals is awful for the ultimate point, which is decisioning. Okay, so I'm going to run out of time fast, so we've looked at all these before. We all agreed, it seemed. We're also smart people. What's new here? What do you think about authentication and decisioning? I think authentication is a legit trend. We're getting better at it. We've gotten the semantics down. Decisioning beyond authorization, I believe, is a real transparent many, many forms of business decisioning, many ways to get finer grained. It isn't just let them in, don't let them in. It doesn't have to be let them in, don't let them in. What's passwordless? Trend? This is like the ultimate complicated one. I mean, in a world where but biometrics might exist, I actually think it's a trope. Not that it's not important, not that we're not doing good work. It's often misapplied, and there's still static shared secrets underneath, and we got to be careful. And there's an interesting transparent going on between passwordless and relationships. As soon as we take away passwords that can be synced between people, no longer can we casually impersonate others for white hat means. We're going to have to fix delegation in relationships. We're going to have to understand them. And last bit, unhappy paths. They get talked about here a lot. What are they? They're still transparent. It's really hard to empathize with people in the way that's necessary. Okay, so I have very little time. What I want to suggest to you guys is we need sharper edge criteria. We need to improve. So what would that mean? Well, instead of saying all Canadians can now use blank to authenticate, you might want to say all Canadians can now use but biometrics to authenticate. It could work, people. Do we have the right yardstick? We've developed a lot of sets of principles over the years. A theme running through the observations I've been able to make in my time here is that compliance isn't really cutting it for the aims we say we have, and perverse incentives keep fooling us. A lot of things in our industry and adjacent ones aren't getting better. So even though we have oodles of principles and laws, and I've been hearing more this week, we need to start tackling some of the hard topics like figuring out mutual ecosystem incentives and not just leaving it to regulations. This diagram reflects a joint project that we've been doing with several partners. We call it operator tokenomics, or respectful personal data brokering. If consent is dying, and if ad tech is dying, we're really going to need a solution that everyone enthusiastically adopts instead because it's good for business and it's good for people. Doesn't have to depend on fixing consent once and for all. It just makes it asynchronous. It doesn't depend on third-party cookies at all. And service providers can know for a certainty that the data that they've collected, they can use and they can share, because they can prove it to users and auditors alike. What might the new criteria look like? Well, there's kind of two camps here, and I'm going to use the word users advisedly, thinking about users of identity, and thinking about the implementers, a lot of folks in this room, and ecosystems of implementers. So for users, does the experience make the right thing to do be the easiest thing to do? Does it enable an autonomous right of permission, not just synchronous consent? And would an ordinary, reasonable person consider to be offered a fair deal at every stage of the relationship? And the Me2B Alliance, now called Internet Safety Labs, is doing some great work here and in putting together some safety specs. Thinking about implementers and ecosystems, well, Alton Brown is famous for talking about the unitaskers, and he wants them out of his kitchen. Is the architecture of the solution cleanly applicable to all kinds of things lying around, not just the one thing? Otherwise, the cost is going to be too high. What is it about the service providers you're working with that makes them willing to outsource verified data? At the end of whatever we try, does personal data storage actually decline ecosystem-wide? We may have perverse incentives doing what we're doing with verifiable credentials. We don't actually know yet. We may have perverse incentives with zero-knowledge proofs. We don't actually know yet. And were specific UD and S criteria satisfied? We want to start making this measurable. And are centralization interest considerations documented? The way I suggested, the way Mark Nottingham kind of suggests. I submit to you, we may have a killer credential in our midst, not the bad kind of killer. The killer app of credentials. What I'm calling private proof of humanity is very similar to what Apple just announced with its private access tokens. OS, browser, and device makers can do this really easily. They can tell if somebody's not a bot. And it's not something anyone will really differentiate on, and you want it to be done continuously. Holders, people who are not bots, benefit from both being anonymous and, by the way, knowing that they're communicating with others who are also not bots, like I know about you right now. And verifiers are really concerned about the fraud just from this one question. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. Happy to share the slides. And there's a lot of folks who helped me with this, so